Hey everybody, welcome back for the fourth and final video of chapter 2. Today we're going to be talking about one specific topic in particular, the quantity theory of money. Now you may have heard it referenced in passing and may have referenced it yourself, but today we're going to formally define it and talk about its implications specifically on inflation. So first we're going to formally define the equation of exchange, then we're going to define the quantity theory of money, and then apply it to a broader commentary discussion on the topic of inflation. So the equation of exchange was developed by Irving Fisher, an economist at Yale in the 20th century, and it says that money times the velocity of money equals the price of money times the GDP of an economy. So we can rearrange that to come up with a definition of what monetary velocity is. Velocity is generally defined as the number of times an M1 unit of currency is spent in GDP timeframe. So for example, the velocity for dollars in the US economy in the 21st century was generally defined to be about 5.6 times. So that means that every dollar was spent 5.6 times in a single year, say 2019. And this is really important because it looks at the rate and speed of transactions and is an important determinant for how much money we need in the economy at any one time. And that is the baseline of the quantity theory of money. And it is all contingent upon this big basic assumption that in the short run, velocity of money is stable. Now, you can argue about this for days and weeks and months, and economists have even devoted their entire lives to talking about monetary velocity and whether or not this is a valid assumption. But the big basic justification for it is that institutional factors generally change slowly. So one very tangible example of this is the US savings rate. So let's pretend COVID didn't exist for a second. This is the US personal savings rate in the 21st century. As you can see, it bops around a little bit. It increases during times of recession because people are scared. But generally speaking, this trend is pretty flat. So this would lend towards a reason why this big assumption that Irving made is valid. However, it kind of breaks down the second that you see things like COVID. Other institutional problems could be, war, the overthrow of a government, just some large impact to the economy that's going to drastically change the habits of people. However, in the absence of this, we aren't just all going to collectively as an economy wake up tomorrow and decide that we want to spend a lot more than we did the day before. So there is a bit of pro and con about the strength of this assumption, but when we hold it to be true, we can start to mess around with equation 1 to get first equation 3, where we define delta as the percent change. We're going to start to use a little bit more economic and mathematical nomenclature to get you guys used to that. But if equation 3 is correct and the big assumption that we just made holds, then we can find that inflation is defined as the percent change in money in an economy minus the percent change in the economy's GDP. And this is a really big uh, assumption to make. So what we're saying here with inflation is that let's say GDP does not change in a year, but let's say that the money supply increased by 10%. That means that inflation in that economy during that period of time was 10%. Now, if the GDP increased by 5%, then inflation would drop down to 5%. So this is the big, broad, if you take one thing out of this chapter, uh, it should be equation 4, which is this basic assumption on how we define inflation. Now, there is some historical evidence to suggest that may be true. So first on the left panel, we look at the growth rate of inflation in the US and then track it against the M2 growth rate. So as you can see, for example, in the late 70s, we had rapid increase in the money supply in the US economy, followed by the 1940s, and we generally see this trend to be true. In a couple times in the 30s and way back in the 1870s, so we don't really, maybe care about that quite as much. We actually saw some negative inflation, but generally speaking, this trend seems to be correct that as we increase M2, inflation goes up. And then when we look at M1 against other countries, and the reason why we use M1 versus M2 is just because there's maybe not quite as good data on M2 in some of these lower income countries like Sudan, you can see a pretty tight linear relationship between inflation rate and the M1 growth rate. So there's a lot of validity to the quantity theory of money just when looking at these graphs. But when we want to care about the US and when we're trying to make policies, we really need to be more precise than that seems about right. We need to measure the exact precision of equation 4, particularly with this big assumption that velocity is generally constant. And then we can apply this like big theory specifically to what's happening with the surge in M1 supply in the US that we talked about in the last video. So if we look at the consumer price index, which is our baseline for inflation in the US, uh, you can see that inflation during COVID was extremely low. However, as we start to get out of COVID, inflation is quickly starting to creep up. And right now, if you look at that, we're only close to like 3% right now, which isn't too bad. That's far from unmanageable. The Fed generally likes inflation to be between 2 and 3%. However, as you can see, this trend is a little bit scary for some economists, as you may imagine. But hold on, you may be wanting to back up a second here. Why was inflation so low during the M1 surge? Well, as you remember, our spending patterns weren't constant, so velocity wasn't constant during the bulk of the pandemic. So, broadly speaking, we had all sorts of alternative factors going on that may have affected the ability for the quantity theory of money to hold true. However, as we get back to normal and back to our old patterns, the Fed and most economists and analysts are starting to be a little bit concerned about the massive quantity of M1 supply and its effect that it may be having on inflation. And so, why even is inflation bad? We've been referencing, oh, we're scared about inflation, that we need to control inflation, but why is it bad in the first place? In a short, it reduces the purchasing power of consumers. So, if an economy had 10% inflation in 1 year, that means that if I had $100 on January 1st, then on December 31st, its value decreased by 10% to $90 equivalent. So it'd be the equivalent of having $90 on January 1st. And in rare instances, it can even get unmanageable. And for a lot of you that don't know what happened in these two examples, this may sound crazy or even fictitious, but this is 100% true. When inflation gets to greater than 50% per month, we define it as hyperinflation. And in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, we had a couple examples of just incredible, insane hyperinflation that really destroyed their economies. So in Zimbabwe, hyperinflation just grew to uncontrollable amounts. The money supply increased by 7,500% per year between 1998 and 2008, and it caused an inflation rate of 15 billion percent per year. And that is billion with a B, that is not a typo. So, a, 1 unit of Zimbabwe's currency at the beginning of 2008 was worth 1/15 billionth of that same value at the end of 2008. And then Zimbabwe is not just a one-off case. In Venezuela, which, as some of you may know, used to be doing quite well economically, its inflation is also just completely out of control, and it's getting worse. As you can see, in 2017, it was 494%. That already sounds really bad because it means that your currency that you accumulate is worth 1/494th of a percent in the end of 2017. But then it got even worse in 2018 to 929,790% in 2018, and then 10 million% in 2019. And why is all this happening? This is just, it seems insanity and it seems very simple. Stop printing money. However, it's not as quite straightforward for that. One of the big reasons for that is because as inflation rises, velocity starts to creep up too, because people know that the value of their money is declining rapidly. So, for example, at restaurants in Venezuela, people started paying before they ordered because by the time they finished eating, the price of their meal went up. So velocity just started to surge along with the money supply, and it just had a massive effect on the price of money, even though their GDP wasn't changing at all, at least in this specific conversation. And so, this all sounds really scary. So we need to, as you can imagine, make sure we don't get into these waters. So, what are some of the warning signs that may start in like uncontrollable inflation in the first place? Well, one of the biggest ones is government budget problems. When the government is in some sort of deficit and debt, it's going to eventually have to start paying that off. And in the case of Zimbabwe and Venezuela, they did so by just printing more money. I've seen those TikToks, I'm sure that many of you have too, about critiquing why people are poor and we can just print more money. This inflation equation and problem is exactly why we can't just print more money for everybody. The next one is corruption. This is just politicians wanting to line their pockets with more cash, so they demanded that their treasuries give them more money. The next one, and this is one that is particularly relevant to our COVID discussion, it is recession. In times of recession, central banks will increase the amount of money in circulation to try and kickstart the economy. And while velocity is low in an economy because people are scared about the recession, that's not a problem. However, if a central bank doesn't rectify the money supply and get it back onto a trend that it can manage, the money supply surge may kickstart an increase in inflation once velocity goes back to normal and people start to fall back on their old spending patterns. And then finally, one of the big last ones are institutional changes, where people are having some sort of external pressure to change the velocity of money because they're scared of war, pandemic, oil, etc. So these last two right now are the big concerns in the U.S. more so than maybe the first two. Although this first one starting to become an increased problem in the U.S. Now, what does central banks have to do with this broader discussion? The answer is pretty much actually everything, because central banks control the percent change in money. As I mentioned, the velocity is determined by the economy, but that delta M is entirely in the hands of the Fed and in central banks. And these first two reasons are big incentives to decentralize central banks, or rather separate them from the rest of the government. Because as long as central banks operate autonomously, they aren't culpable for bailing out their own government and for lining the pockets of their own politicians. And so, in this figure in front of you, this shows how important it is to have central bank independence. So, when you look at less central or more controlled central banks, like in New Zealand and Spain, you see high inflation. When you look at the US, Switzerland, and Germany, who have very independent central banks, they generally have much more manageable inflation numbers. And this is true across the spectrum, even in less developed countries. So it's actually really important for central banks to have autonomy to be able to sort out things like inflation on their own. And that is an important conversation right now in the United States as some politicians ask for more control over the central bank. Some people are critical of current President Jerome Powell's actions in increasing the M1 supply, but a lot of people in the Fed respond with this graph right here, that they want their independence to sort out the economy on their own. So to leave you with some closing thoughts and discussion and tidbits to think about. First, do you think that the Fed should be regulated by Congress more closely? Do you think that this uncontrollable surge of M1 money is a good reason for uh, Congress to regulate the Fed to make sure that the Fed can't do that in the future? And is it even a problem in the first place? Should we actually be concerned about the M1 supply, or do you trust the Fed to reel it back in? And then finally, as we start to see an increase in inflation in the United States, what do you think the Fed can and should do to try and slow the increase of inflation in the United States? I hope you enjoyed these videos and you now have all the content that you should need to complete the Chapter 2 quiz.